Gaat u zitten. So, welcome and good afternoon. I hereby open the public meeting of the Doctorate Committee of Nathan Cassee. The meeting will be in hybrid form, so some of the people in the audience will be remotely present, and we will also have 2 members of the committee being present remotely. I kindly ask the doctoral candidate and his seconds to come forward and take their place behind the lectern. So I would like to give the word to the promoter, Professor Serebrenik, to ask the first question.
Dank u, meneer director. Geachte promovendus Nathan, can you please summarize your work in roughly 10 minutes?
Hooggeleerde promotor, thank you for the question. Of course I can. But first of all, I want to thank you all for being here. It's good to see so many familiar faces. And what I want to do in the next 10 minutes is I want to give a brief overview and explain why we studied sentiment in software engineering. I want to briefly describe the notion, and then I want to explain some of the findings in my thesis that I think are most relevant for the audience here. But first of all, when I was making this presentation a week ago and I was Googling stereotypes about software engineering, this was one of the things that popped up. And maybe we all used to see software engineering as this very technical engineering discipline, but this is most certainly not the case anymore. And I hope I don't really need to convince anyone here in this room that software engineers are by no means robots, but instead, as illustrated by this character here, they're humans. And modern software engineering is an incredibly collaborative process. And at many points during a workday, developers communicate with other developers, with other team members, or with stakeholders. And where humans communicate, they express emotions. So emotions are something that we all express in our communication. We use it to form interpersonal bonds with each other, or we use it to emphasize ideas or to highlight some things we think are important. And before I started my PhD, it was already quite clear that there's a lot of places where software engineers choose to express these emotions. And they not only express these emotions during face-to-face contact, but they also express these emotions on all sorts of digital platforms where developers collaborate with each other. But what we didn't know when I started my PhD was why exactly developers choose to use emotions when they are communicating with each other, when they are having technical discussions, but also what effect these expressions of emotions have on maybe decision-making processes, or maybe the way certain technical decisions are made. So this is what we worked on in chapters 5 and 6 of my PhD thesis, and I will briefly go over this. But first, I want to point out that studying emotions can be incredibly complex. There's a lot of scientific theories that are out there on different models of emotions. And what I want to do is I want to, for the remainder of this presentation, use a simplification where we talk about sentiment. And sentiment is a categorization of emotions into 3 broad categories, where you have positive emotions, neutrality, the absence of any emotions, and negativity. So any negative emotions like anger, fear, or sadness. Now, to understand what role emotions might play in software engineering, we focused on technical depth. And for those of you unfamiliar with the idea of technical depth, it's this idea that there are, it's a metaphor used by developers to sometimes describe suboptimal implementations in programming. And these suboptimal implementations are often made to meet some short-term goals or to meet some short-term deadlines. and is called technical debt because the longer this is present in a software system, the more expensive it becomes to actually fix or to remove this from a software system. Now, in practice, what does technical debt actually look like? Well, it looks a little bit like this, like the code fragment you can't fully read here, but this is technical debt is often just a piece of code that solves a problem, but that isn't really implemented quite well. Now, for my thesis, we focused on a specific category of technical debt called self-admitted technical debt. It's called self-admitted technical debt because it combines a piece of code with a very brief description of what the problem actually is in this source code. And when we came across this notion, we asked ourselves the question, as you can already see in the example here, this can be a mess, is quite a negative use of language. We asked ourselves the question, well, how often do developers actually use negativity to describe this technical debt? To answer this question, and this is where the first contribution of my thesis comes in, we of course had to first understand what does it mean to actually express negativity in self-admitted technical debt. Because technical debt is in and of itself already quite a negative concept for developers because this has to do with suboptimal implementations. So we came up with a labeling guideline in which we separated, or in which we clearly defined this notion, and we explained, well, you have technical debt that can be very, or you have self-admitted technical debt that can be very factual, where you have very factual descriptions, or you have examples on the slide here where there is a clear emphasis on problems in the source code using words commonly associated with affective lexicon, so with anger or with sadness. So we took these labeling guidelines and we took 1,000 of these instances, so 1,000 pieces of code with descriptions on the problems that were present in them, and we studied two things with a large team of labelers. We first of all tried to understand the type of technical issues that were described in these pieces of self-admitted technical debt, but we also tried to understand whether, according to our guidelines, negativity was expressed. So what we found is if you have these three different categories of issues that can be described, so ranging from code that isn't finished yet, partially implemented code, to functional issues, or commonly known as bugs, we find that the amount of times negativity is used to describe these technical issues can differ quite a lot over these categories. Now, as follow-up question, we asked ourselves, well, could this maybe be because developers just care more about bugs or functional issues? And is this maybe used as a communication mechanism to describe maybe the priority of these items? So does this mean that developers use this as a proxy for priority? To study this, we did two follow-up studies. We conducted a survey with 46 developers from open source and closed source backgrounds, and we asked them these questions. Do you actually write self-admitted technical debt that expresses negative emotions? Do you interpret negativity as a proxy for priority? Do you handle based on the negativity that is used to describe self-admitted technical debt? And we found that between 25 to 30% of developers actually admits to doing this. Now, of course, we all know from research that sometimes there can be a very large gap between what people say they do and what people actually do. So to further investigate this, we did a follow-up study and we conducted an experiment. So the goal of this experiment was to really dive into this question: does the presence of negativity actually affect the way developers estimate priority or the way they perceive the priority of the self-admitted technical debt? And we choose to use an experiment because it gives us a very high internal validity. It gives us a very high level of control over what we're actually studying, and this way we hope to isolate this effect of negativity on the perception of priority. So we took several instances from this data set that we had already labeled, some that were very fact-based, very neutral, some that were very negative. And for each of these items that we selected, we created paired examples. So if neutrality, or if it was a very factual description of the self-admitted technical debt, we kept the same code snippet, but we changed the description to include some negative use of language, to emphasize the problem using anger or maybe using sadness. And then when we had a participant participating in the experiment, so a developer with some experience, we randomly assigned some of these examples that we had created, and we asked this participant, right, what priority score do you think that this piece of technical debt has? How much time do you think it will take you to fix this piece of technical debt? And the goal of these questions was, by randomly assigning these snippets to different developers and by gathering a lot of data, that we could use statistics to actually dig out all of these effects and to dig out and try to see if it's merely the change in language that's used to describe this piece of technical debt, this suboptimal implementation, whether this actually results in a change in priority scores. So for the experiment, we had 75 developers who participated. Most of these had quite a lot of experience, at least 3 or 4 years of programming experience. And we asked them about 3 different things. We asked them about the urgency of the piece of technical debt. We asked them about the importance. And we asked them about the effort they think it would take to fix this. And we found that when it comes to urgency or importance, 1/3 of developers actually increases their score for these constructs when negativity is used to describe an item, whereas for the effort, about 50% of developers are more likely to give a higher priority score. And surprisingly, even developers who who think that they are not affected by this, turn out to be affected when they're estimating effort. So this really shows that even though developers might not be aware, they are being influenced merely by the use of negativity to describe these technical problems. So this allows us to conclude at the end of chapter 6 that it is really the negativity present in these source code descriptions that is causing this change in priority, or this change in perception of priority, at least for a group of developers. Now, for the developers maybe in the audience here, does this then mean that you should use negativity to describe items you care about? Well, obviously, we don't think you should, because if you have a team where maybe people are affected differently, the dynamics change a little bit. Coming up with prioritizations, coming up with an accurate prioritization score is more difficult if there's one person who thinks they can draw attention to the issues they care about merely by using negativity. So this is one of the contributions we make in my thesis in chapters 5 and 6. So this is about the practice of software engineering. We also studied theory and tools in chapters 2, 3, and 4. But unfortunately, there's not a lot of time to go into this for the presentation. So I will leave it at this. If you're interested, please read the thesis for these other chapters. And thank you.
Okay, thank you for your explanation. Professor Serebrenik, are you satisfied?
Yes, meneer director, I am satisfied.
Okay. Eindhoven University of Technology very much values the presence of experts from outside our own university in doctorate committees. Today we are privileged to welcome Professor Storey from the University of Victoria in Canada. And she is online. Professor Feldt from Chalmers University. Professor Penta from University of Sannio in Italy. Professor Novielli from the University of Bari in Italy. And Professor van Deursen from Delft. The time investment for reading, evaluating the thesis is significant, and also for attending today's meeting. So we are very grateful for you that you are willing to put in all this effort. Okay, I would like to give the second question to Professor Storey.
Thank you, meneer Director, for giving me this opportunity to ask questions. Geachte promovendus, thank you for your presentation today and also for the opportunity to read your thesis and learn about your work. I appreciated the attention you gave me to the detailed questions that I sent you and how you address those in your revised thesis. So my questions today will follow up a little bit on some of those questions and also more general questions. So your thesis basically starts off with the question, how can opinion mining and emotion mining support software development activities? And I think that your work is extremely timely, given the emergence of generative AI and how it's being adopted. And so with that in mind, how do you think, what do you think are the main theoretical contributions in answering those questions from your thesis in respect to the use and the emergence of generative AI today?
Hooggeleerde opponent, thank you very much for your question. And I think it's also a very good question in the sense that this emergence of all of these big new generative language models maybe allows us to do things that were previously impossible to study. Because in chapter 2, we discuss a lot of the limitations that there's actually are in mining opinions of developers, maybe mining the way developers talk about certain problems that they have with the tools that they're using. And I think that so far, most of the big generative language models that are out there should be able to much more efficiently handle these tasks. Only what I don't really know, or what I think is still an open question, is that there have been some researchers, I think from the group of David Loeb, for instance, Ting Zhang, that have tried to actually apply these large language models to some of the data sets or some of the tasks that are out there in literature. And so far, this has shown that in these very close tasks, these language models are still not very proficient, maybe because they don't really know the context of software engineering well enough, maybe because our tasks are not well defined enough. But I think that all of the theoretical problems that we sketch in chapter 2 are still very much relevant even to these large language models. And yeah, we can use these large language models to explore whether we can fix some of these issues that we describe in chapter 2.
Great, thank you for your answer, Geachte Promovendus. Staying with maybe some of the questions that arose for me in chapter 2, you talk a lot about issues such as using this work to estimate, say, for example, the trust scores between developers on GitHub projects. And you also talk about using these techniques for regulating the emotions of developers, as well as also potentially putting a filter on the emotions of software engineers. So I wanted you to think a little bit about what are the risks maybe of doing that, of defining metrics, say, based on how people communicate, or in changing how we present ourselves, or even, gaming somehow those metrics that change how we present ourselves. And my overarching question really for that is to ask you if you have thought about different ethical guidelines that we should be thinking of in terms of how emotion mining and opinion mining tools are developed and the kinds of analyses that they do, but also how those tools are used in the hands of the people that use them. And I recognize that is a very big question. So if you want to focus it a bit more on the context of how these tools are used in development activities, and rather than say opinions on apps or whatever, that would be fine. So have you thought about these ethical guidelines at all, and how would you answer that?
Yeah, hooggeleerde opponent, thank you very much. Again, a very good and a very interesting question. And I think undoubtedly, during these past 4 or 5 years in my PhD, I think my own thinking has evolved quite a lot in this, and this is maybe reflects why in this earlier chapter we still made these comments, because of course, as emotions are so crucial to the way we communicate, regulating them in any way is incredibly challenging. And I think we even close with that in chapter 6, where we say maybe it is even unavoidable that developers really express all of these emotions, because we use it to emphasize the problems or the ideas that we really care about. And therefore, I think when we're using this in any way to study the team management or the performance of individual developers, or whether we even use this to evaluate the performance of developers based on how much they express emotions or how negative they are being, is maybe not a very fair or a very valid way. And whether we should come up with these ethical guidelines, I don't really know, because I would hope or I would expect that there should be tons of ethical guidelines already out there on how we actually manage people, or how we use all of these data or all of this information that we can gather from these collaborative systems that we can gather to evaluate people, and that we really shouldn't be doing it in a very, sorry, how do you say that? That we shouldn't be doing this merely based on the numbers, but we should always be considering context.
Right, thank you. And actually following up a little bit to your answer about considering context, I'll switch to chapter 5 as I notice time is going by faster than I anticipated. So geachte promovendus, I really enjoyed reading chapter 5. A lot of details, a lot of nice results in there. Really appreciated also the use of mixed methods. And as I was reading that, several questions came to mind. I'll focus on one of them. And that is the negativity that you found in the Stack Overflow posts, and you hinted on this a little bit as well, and that those could be related to culture. How would this, impact the use of negativity to implicate priority? This was also something that came up earlier in chapter 2 as well.
Yeah, hooggeleerde opponent, again, thank you very much. And I think that's also a very good question, and I think that's also why I strongly consider it to be future work for this thesis to step over these individual cases and to really focus on group dynamics as well. Because I've taken a very general view here. I've talked about software engineering as a very general process, but we all know that within every company or even within every development team within a company, there's really different cultures. And probably the way technical debt is described here and whether negativity is used is something that's very dependent probably on context of the team, the culture of the team, maybe also the culture of the developers themselves, whether developers feel they are free to actually express the emotions they are experiencing. And this is, of course, something that probably affected the labeling that we were doing here, because it is very difficult for us as researchers to dive into this context and to try and understand this context. But I think the viewpoint that we took there is that these are examples taken from open source. And we know that there's tons of different people that contribute to open source. So by having a labeling team that was mixed, where we had people from different countries, we tried to, at least also through a lot of open discussions, try to approach this as generally as possible. So what we would expect that maybe an average developer could find when reading these examples.
Great, thank you, Nathan. Your director, I think I'm still okay for one more question.
I think that I would like to go to the next.
Okay. Yes.
Phone.
Thank you very much, geachte promovendus. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, the opposition will be continued by Professor Di Penta.
Thank you, Mr. Director, and geachte promovendus. Thanks for your work. Very strong from an empirical perspective, and with chapters published in top software engineering journal and very good conferences. So I have very general and perspective-related questions. So the first question is in some sense related to what was discussed before, but more specific on the fact that people are different in terms of how they feel and express emotions. There are people that are very negative. There are people that are very positive always, and people that are kind of neutral. As paper reviewers, there are some reviewers that are always negative. So since one of your key findings is that negativity is used to change priority, how can we isolate the effect of a specific person and avoid this effect too much the prioritization?
Hooggeleerde opponent, thank you very much for your question. So one idea that comes to mind, but that we really haven't explored here, so I really don't know if this is actually technically feasible, but there's of course this idea of neutralization of sentiment, where you can take a piece of text where sentiment or emotions are expressed, and you can use some language rewriting tool to change this effective state. And in fact, we've tried to use techniques for chapter 6 to create all of these paired examples. Now, I can imagine, and especially with the emergence of generative AI, that we can actually have tools that are quite powerful that we can use to take all of these negative examples and to neutralize them in a way to make sure that people that are known for doing this, or code bases where a lot of negativity is used to describe technical issues, that we can actually remove negativity to make sure that all of the technical issues are described in a more consistent way. So I would expect that that's one way we could address this problem.
Thank you very much. My next two questions rechte promovendus are related to the advent and the use of generative AI in software development. So I expect we are going to see more and more natural language comments and text in software artifacts that are not written by humans, but they are automatically generated. So how this will influence techniques that leverage opinion mining, sentiment analysis in software engineering?
Ja, hooggeleerde opponent, again, thank you very much. So I can imagine this has quite a big effect on all of these techniques that we're using to study natural language written by developers, and this probably extends even outside of the context of sentiment in software engineering. But specifically for sentiment, what we've already seen from other researchers is that when you ask generative AI to answer Stack Overflow questions, these Stack Overflow questions that generative AI, or these answers that generative AI generates, they are maybe not factually correct, but they are much more positive than humans would otherwise write these answers. And by making them very positive, it makes it difficult for us to actually study this because we don't know what a human has written and we don't know what a generative AI has written. But also this makes it more easier for developers to be misled because when an answer is very positive, you're more likely to go along with it, at least according to this particular study on Stack Overflow questions. So I think this makes this advent of natural language that has been generated by AI quite risky also for this field because it is more difficult to study ground truth, and it's also more difficult, or it's the odds of developers being misled by this are also present.
Thank you, Groote Promovendus. And my last question is still related to generative AI, but more on matters related to self-admitted technical debt and technical debt. So in some of your chapters, you have detected self-admitted technical debt using, very conventional methods, using keywords and so on. Mm-hmm. And those comments were associated to code that we know was, in some sense, suboptimal. We also know that since this is open source code, it has been used for sure to train generative AI, which also means that nowadays people are relying on that code. Is there any way we can mitigate this problem? So the fact that generative AI has been trained basically on technical debt.
Hooggeleerde opponent, thank you for probably a very difficult question. I am by no means a machine learning or a deep learning expert, and I can imagine that there's a lot of very smart people at Google and Microsoft that are also trying to fix this problem, because as I can imagine, you are perfectly right. A lot of code that exists online is suboptimal for hundreds of reasons. We even know that Stack Overflow questions themselves, or Stack Overflow answers themselves, are often factually incorrect or not as reliable as we like to think they are. And this is probably where humans will still and always be very important in preparing all of this training data or preparing all of these data sets that we then use to train these generative AI models, because probably only an experienced developer can look at the source code examples or the technical debt items in our data sets and explain what should have been done to fix them, or be able to select what is problematic, self-admitted technical debt that you don't want these systems to be trained on, and what are good examples of files in these repositories that we should train these generative AI models on.
Thank you, Groote Promovendus, and Mine Director, this is everything from my side.
Okay, thank you very much. Then the opposition will be continued by Professor Feldt.
Thank you, meneer de rector. And geachte Promovendus, I thank you for writing this thesis, and it's very interesting. And I was very glad that you invited me because I enjoyed diving deeper into your work. Now I have a few questions, and I guess several of them relates to the fact that you make very clear that you're studying expressed emotion. But I would like to know, how do you see the connection from the expressed emotion of a developer and their sort of internal, actual or raw emotions? That I guess, is this distinction relevant or not to you? Or how do you view the connection here?
Hooggeleerde opponent, thank you very much for a very good question. I think this connection is incredibly important. And there's also a reason why we focus on the expressed side of the emotion, because, well, you can either not experience any emotions and still choose to express them to emphasize a point, or you can, conversely, when you're really feeling an emotion, you can choose to suppress it and write a very factual description of a problem. And this masking that people sometimes do is a research field in and of itself, and actually understanding what developers actually feel when they're working on a system is an entirely different field of research. And we choose to focus on the expressed side of the emotion, even though we acknowledge that there's a very important connection, because this is, of course, what other people come across when they're either working with these texts or reading with these texts. And this is also why we focus on the expressed emotion, because we expect any developer to read this to interpret the same emotions that we extract from the items that we're studying.
Thank you, geachte promovendus. This makes a lot of sense, of course. So you're not studying the expressed emotions as a proxy for the real ones. It's for you, it's a very different research field, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
But do you then think that there are some limitations in the applicability of results due to this? I mean, is there a risk that someone sort of reads your work as trying to detect the actual emotions? And
obviously, there could very well be a risk in there, and I think if you look at the thesis in its entirety, of course, in the introduction, we try to make quite clear that there's this bridge. And also in the conclusion that there's this bridge and we only focus on one side of it. We don't really focus on the other side. For the individual studies, this might be a little bit more challenging indeed, and it could very well be a good idea to be as explicit as possible on where we as researchers think that we are standing. And yeah, what sort of like, how do we say this correctly? What the actual, how far our findings actually go, right? Yeah.
Thank you. So, geachte promovendus, so if I wanted to study the raw emotion, would you advise me to not use these tools? Should I use other methodological approaches or data collection methods? And if so, which ones?
Hooggeleerde opponent, I think... well, what I would first of all, of course, recommend you to do is to talk to the person sitting right of you, because she arguably is the expert here on also studying the emotions that developers really feel. But I think it also really depends on the research question that you're going for. Probably if you're interested in the link between the two, so where do developers feel emotions and where do they express them, it makes sense to use both of these, to use the automated tools and then use some form of biometrics. If you're really only interested in what developers actually feel, I think there's, again, a wide mix of methodologies that you can use, from biometrics to combining this with things like diary studies. Because, of course, also what we feel and what we think we feel, there's also still a gap between the two, also when it comes to emotions, of course. And both are probably as interesting to study.
Thank you. So in the study about self-admitted technical debt, would you see some value in actually going back to these specific comments? I mean, if you could access some of the developers who had written these comments, would it be interesting to ask them about, basically trying to remember what they were thinking? Why did they express themselves in this negative or positive way? Or
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's still one of the very interesting follow-up questions that we still have here, because even though in the surveys we ask developers about very general scenarios, have you ever expressed a self-admitted technical debt where negativity is used to describe it, there's of course a big gap again between what you feel at the time you're actually doing something or how you are deciding to express yourself. And as much as I would love to, it's of course very difficult to study this because usually when developers feel emotions, it's also quite a private moment in time, and to intrude in that as researchers also of course runs the risk of contaminating our data collection.
Okay, thank you. So I have another question here, which is slightly different. So I'm thinking about generalization of your results or some of your findings to non-textual type of communication. Do you think there is something we can learn about, let's say, how people might express emotions in team meetings, in real, in actual meetings, face-to-face, so to speak? Or would that be kind of, dangerous to generalize to that type of setting?
I think it would be quite risky to generalize, even on a one-on-one setting, to of course generalize to this, because the setting where you're reading a piece of text versus when you're talking face-to-face with someone and you're seeing the way someone expresses emotions, there's probably a too big of a gap there to actually make this generalization, especially because emotions in person can be much stronger. You can express anger much more strongly in person than you can in the description of a piece of self-admitted technical debt. If you go to the examples, even though they are negative, it's not like there's a 10-page comment describing all the ways the developer is angry. Whereas, of course, in a Teams meeting, it's quite conceivable that someone is clearly angry for at least a minute before they express a point, and that probably influences someone much more than these textual comments.
Can you also see some benefit in that? I mean, if you could study their emotions live, so to speak, in
Definitely, there could definitely be some benefit in doing this live, but I think this is also, as has been shown also by Nicole, of course, is that it's very difficult to even do this live in a reliable setting, because you never really know when, why, or how a developer is feeling something. Even if you have a Teams meeting, there could have been something going on in the private lives of a developer that makes them express something. And also, of course, the way someone interprets anger that's expressed in a Teams meeting. Yeah.
I was more thinking, even the expression is, in some sense, probably harder to mask, right? If you're live, it's harder for you to be cognitively deciding to express an emotion if it's live.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And with that, I leave it again to Meneer Director.
Okay, thank you for the questions. Then the opposition will be continued by Professor van Deursen.
Dank u wel, meneer de rector. Geachte promovendus, I had a great time studying your impressive thesis, very nice work, and I have a few questions. And maybe I start with some questions concerning Chapter 4, because Chapter 4 is on Stack Overflow. And I used to love Stack Overflow. It's a little less now because of OpenAI and ChatGPT, etc. But still, it is dear to me. The philosopher Hegel, he had a famous quote: "De waarheid is concreet, truth is concrete," meaning lots of examples can really help to make a point in such a chapter. And for Chapter 4, I was sort of hoping for an actual Stack Overflow question on every page to illustrate all the many points you're trying to make. But luckily there is one example in your chapter. I think it's on page 103 on the right. But that is a bit of a problematic question, as in it was very hard to assess the positive, negative, neutral thing there. A question I have for this one is it actually because if I understand correctly, in Chapter 4, it's about self-admitted technical debt and security.
It's about security technical debt, which
technical debt.
Confusingly.
And this question, I do see security. How is it security technical debt?
You mean the example in italics at the bottom of the page 103?
On page 103.
Yes. Please allow me to read the context.
I understand that the classification of technical depth wasn't really done by you, so you're reusing this, but still.
Exactly, and what I'm first of all wondering, because I don't see it in the writing here, and maybe I should have been a little bit more consistent here, but in chapter 4, of course, there's a comparison that's being made between security questions and security technical depth questions. And these are both being classified. So it could well be that the example we are looking at here is not so much a security technical depth question, but it's a security question. But for this, of course, I'd have to go back into the data to verify to which of the two this belongs. But we classified these two categories with the tools, and from there maybe this difference occurs.
Okay. And maybe to get a feeling for how difficult this classification is, because this was the only example I saw. So I decided to go to some of my own answers on Stack Overflow. So let's go through, but unfortunately, I know very little about security. So they are not really about security. So they are on other topics. But I found one, a recent one that's about, well, the question, I only answer questions. So pandas cannot open an Excel is the question. And the question is, please see my code below, and then it is import pandas read Excel. And after that, it gives me the following error, and then a huge tag trace. Maybe the first question is a question like this. Is it security? Is it technical depth? Is it neutral, positive, or negative?
So if I can repeat the question for my own understanding, it's about pandas opening in Excel.
Exactly.
You have a code fragment and then you have an error message and you have a question. Yeah, right. So of course, I mean, I wouldn't expect this question to either be security or to be about technical depth, unless there is more context somewhere in the comments of the question. This could be taken from an existing system, but I don't expect it to be, because this sounds like quite a novice question. And when it comes to whether there's actually emotions expressed, I think this first of all depends on what theoretical framework you use to judge this, because there is some politeness in I think there's some politeness in the question. Please, if I go back, yeah, exactly. There's please, and it depends a little bit on whether you consider please to be an expression of positivity or not. Generally, I would say it's not, so I would say it's neutral. But there's a difference of opinions there. Sometimes people or labelers think that this would be an example of a positive question because you have these politeness in here.
Okay, and then we have the first, so thanks, I agree. Then we have the first, or the most upvoted answer. As noted in the release email, link to the retreat from the release tweet, noted in large warnings, and present in the README and the release on PyPy. The library used explicitly removed support for anything other than XLS files. I didn't exactly read it neutrally, but how would you frame this, classify this? Is this neutral, positive, negative?
So I think this is a very good example that you've chosen to highlight here, simply because of the fact that when we use sentiment or when we use emotions as a very discrete categorization, it sometimes can become very difficult to label instances such as these, where if you use a very rich labeling model where you acknowledge a lot of different emotions, you could sort of like a snippiness. I don't really know the English word for this, but there is sort of like you can interpret this as someone being very low in patience towards the person that asked the question, and therefore you could consider this to be an expression of negative emotions. But I think here it is because you're lacking any strong effective language. I think also that if I would have labeled this in a study, I would have labeled this as neutral, but it depends, I think, quite strongly on the labeling guidelines that are there, probably also the research questions that you have. What do you want to study? Is this about impoliteness on Stack Overflow? Then probably you would consider this negative. Is this about anger on Stack Overflow? This would be neutral.
Yeah, I understand. So I think the way it is worded is as neutral as possible. But you can also see a lot of frustration with this person.
Yeah, but maybe this is also where we go back to the questions that Professor Feldt had been asking, because this is also why this can be such a challenging concept to study, because there's many factors you can include. And ideally you have labeling guidelines where you clearly state that it's about the message it conveys and maybe not what you think the person was feeling at the time they were writing this.
Yeah. And then the first, with an answer, you can also have notes.
Comments.
Comments. And the first comment to this answer is, let me find it, sorry, here. This is a prime example on how versions should not be released. So is this positive, negative, or neutral?
Again, a very good, a very interesting question. In a way, unfortunately, I mean, this depends on so many things, also in the way, in what are we studying? What do we actually want to understand? How do we want to separate these comments? I think if you really go back to a very simple emotional model, I still would consider to be this a little bit more on the neutral side, because again, you're lacking really strong, effective words. But we're getting closer to this area where maybe there's a good discussion in sort of like the conflict resolution session at the end of the labeling study.
Yeah. And so this person continues, this change breaks a lot of existing code. And so now suddenly it becomes about technical depth.
Yeah.
And because with this change, suddenly a lot of code in the world has become technical depth. So I think even, maybe the question here is, the labeling of technical depth, did it take this type of technical depth also into account?
The labeling in chapter 4, you mean?
Yeah,
or
the notion of technical depth in chapter 4, yeah. Or maybe also chapter 6, if 5. If.
Yeah, so I think specifically for chapter 4, because they really make they really focus on security questions. I think this is all out of the question, especially because they probably only looked at the questions itself and not even the discussions that's going on within all of these comments. But this is clearly, of course, indeed an example of where this common thread might actually continue on to start discussing concepts related to technical depth. Yes.
It does, yes.
Yeah, probably it does indeed, because this is probably...
And does that make the whole, does that then propagate back to the question? Is the question itself and also technical depth in your approach? I don't expect it to. And again, of course, we reuse the data from the original authors. And I don't really have sharp in my head what they exactly used. I think they used a keyword-based approach to filter this. And I don't know if they considered keywords in the comments, actually, because there's a separation there. But I think in this case, they wanted to separate the original question that was being asked. So they wanted to separate the original question. So I would expect, or I would hope, that this then doesn't go over into the data set, because even though this is going on in the comments, the original question didn't have anything to do with technical depth. Yeah. And then the author of this...
Maybe you can keep your question short.
Keep the question short, or...
Well, maybe you can ask him if it's very short, and the answer should also be short.
I'll do my best.
Meneer Director, I am having a good time with this question. I have another question I could ask, or I could yield and move on to the next. What is
okay?
What would you like
then I propose that we go on with the Professor Fletcher.
Thank you very much. Dank u wel, meneer Director.
Geachte promovendus, Nathan. First of all, thanks very much for the lovely thesis. I enjoyed very much. I learned a lot. As you know, I'm not a software engineer, so for me, it's a lot of new ways of looking at the world. So thank you very much for that experience. Given the time, I think I might ask just one question, and it's actually to go in the other direction from concrete examples to more theoretical questions at the other end of the extreme, just to try to understand your sort of theoretical conceptual framing of your work. Right, so there's, in chapter 1, right, so you set up the study of emotion and sentiment in software engineering, and you introduce models such as Russell's model, where we have these sort of axes: valence, arousal, dominance. We have Pang and Lee for sentiment, where we put things into these three categories. And we had earlier models where we have, 7 categories into which we place emotion. Right. So there's the common phrase, the common aphorism, I think it comes out of statistics, where all models are wrong. but some are useful, right? So clearly all of these models are wrong. I mean, you can't map human emotional experience into 7 categories or 3 buckets or a point in a finite dimensional, space, a vector in a finite dimensional space. So clearly they're wrong. I mean, if they were right, then we would no longer write poetry or sing love songs. So clearly they're wrong, but also they're clearly useful, right? So at the level, so your general study is emotion and sentiment in software engineering. Can you talk about how these models, these framings of emotion and sentiment are wrong for your work, for the field of software engineering? And where are they useful? So clearly you've given lots of examples of where they're extremely useful, but can you kind of delimit the space a little bit by giving us what's on the other side of this fence and what belongs inside of this fence?
Hooggeleerde opponent, thank you very much for a very interesting question. So just to clarify a little bit, this is about where maybe these models aren't that useful to study software engineering. Yeah, exactly. I think why this has been so much work over the past 5 years is exactly why these models don't really work in software engineering, in the sense that when we're looking at self-admitted technical debt, we try to group things into 3 buckets that we sort of like inherit from a very general psychology worldview. But there's so many other concepts and contexts that are relevant for self-admitted technical debt that just purely classifying something as negative is maybe not even the right way to go forward, simply because, as I already said in the presentation, self-admitted technical debt is inherently negative for a developer, or technical debt. And then when we were labeling this, we were running into a lot of discussions and a lot of problems. We're coming up with a good definition, and in essence with these labeling guidelines we've probably created a little bit our own submodel within maybe this wider framing or within this wider categorization to actually solve this, because there's so much rich domain and lingo within software engineering that just mapping in a piece of text what has been expressed into 3 buckets is way too simple, or it's way too simplistic. And we try to make do in the methodologies that we're using, but it has clearly been quite difficult to get this right and to study this.
Could you give an example of things that go beyond these sorts of framings of emotion and sentiment in studying the social life of software engineering?
How do you mean exactly?
So, for example, any sort of model has to eliminate everything but what's in the model. So what are some things that fall outside of these sorts of framings of emotion? I'm thinking, for example, of maybe political aspects of expressing emotion, or some aspects of context. So, for example, we were discussing earlier, say cooperative contexts, where there's more at play than say prioritizing technical debt, but there's individual sort of politics and diplomacy going on. So these sorts of things. Those are just examples that kind of pop into my head.
Yeah, so I'm still having a little bit of trouble trying to understand exactly what you're getting at. So please correct me if I'm veering off on the wrong track. But I think where this stops, where this becomes more and more complex, or where this really stops working, is the moment you sort of like step outside of this very simplified model that we're studying. Because in chapter 6 we study this model where you have a piece of technical debt, you have a developer reading a piece of technical debt, and then that results in some priority score. This is, of course, because we were doing an experiment, a very simplified worldview. And the second you step outside of this worldview, this is probably where all of these things become so much more complex. And this is also why we choose to study this in the context of an experiment, because there's so many things that will influence how a developer is reading a piece of text, also the desk they're sitting at that day, the people they've had coffee with that day, stuff like this, that all influences the sort of like downstream decision. So if you go maybe to the causal diagram that we sketched, there's so many probably other nodes that also affect this prioritization score in the real world that it becomes very difficult to isolate or to study individual effects.
These are the kinds of things I had in mind. Am I out of time?
I think that it is good that we give the word now to the co-promoter. Professor Novielli from the University of Bari.
Thank you, meneer Director, for giving me the possibility to ask questions. Geachte promovendus, thank you very much for the presentation and for taking the question and for contributing to the field of software engineering with your research. So, linking back to the question we were having about experienced emotion and expressed emotion, you've been focused on individuals, first of all, so how people convey emotion in the language, basically. And you've been also focusing on expressed emotion. However, I was wondering whether you have any opinion or idea on how you could be possibly following up on this research by considering, for example, perceived emotion, as we were discussing related to the question of Stack Overflow. Because perception of emotion probably is also relevant in terms of the effectiveness of communication. And as we know, emotion are an antecedent of effectiveness of team working towards the same goal. And software engineering is a collaborative effort. So I was wondering, what do you think about this? Whether you think it would be relevant as a follow-up research direction, and if you have any idea on possible study that could be meaningful.
Yeah, hooggeleerde co-promotor, thank you very much for your question. I think this is indeed also a very interesting follow-up question, because going back to the details of Chapter 6, in this experiment, we never asked participants whether they were perceiving any emotion when they were reading the text. And maybe this could also be one of the factors that would have influenced how they actually interpret the priority score. And probably within a team setting or within any sort of dynamic where you're discussing something with a group, whether you actually perceive an emotion that is conveyed through text or whether you actually feel any emotions yourself, influences this dynamic. When it is about how to study this or what would approaches be to study this, I think here there is a big opportunity also for the wider field of software engineering to study more and more and to try and focus more and more on these group settings, on these dynamics, and to work with existing instruments taken from psychology on what emotions you are perceiving and how we can ask developers in diary studies how they perceive things, to then try to see if we can link certain effects back to what developers perceive at that moment in time. But these are difficult studies to do because they take a lot of investment both from us as researchers and a lot of buy-in from industry or open source developers.
Thank you very much. So if I can continue. Then so the next question is, providing that you're giving evidence that people actually use the expression of emotion in a way which is intended to kind of directing communication and the impact of what they're saying, even if it's not like really what you advocate in favor of, like using negativity for prioritization, as you were saying in the presentation of your work, still based on the finding of your study, of your empirical study, how would you envisage like practice should be impacted? What are the implications for tool builders, for example? Do you have any recommendation based on the finding of your study on, for example, on technical debt?
So I think there's two ways that maybe tool builders or maybe developers could use the findings of the study. I think one, of course, what we describe a lot in this thesis are the challenges or the issues that exist with specific tools or the differences that are there with tools. And there's probably gaps there to further improve the automatic classifiers that we use. But I think also the second opportunity here is that by showing that merely the presence of negativity can have an effect on how developers make a technical decision, can also make a much more stronger argument for the neutralization of text that developers use to communicate with each other and explain, because we see so many different examples for platforms where developers are actually expressing emotions in Stack Overflow and GitHub and issue reports, and maybe these findings can be used to explain why we actually need tools that neutralize these questions that are being asked or that neutralize these bug reports to make sure that they are all handled in a consistent way or evaluated in a consistent way by developers.
Okay, thank you very much. So basically you're recommending that one of the potential action correction could be towards supporting developers in writing effective text by avoiding emotion.
Yeah, and either by doing this actively or retrospectively, because we know that, I mean, active tools developers don't really like if you're being corrected while you're writing something, but maybe doing this in a way where we take an existing lingo and we remove explicit.
Hora Est. You have finished your sentence, but as you stopped. So this brings us to the end of this hour that gives an opportunity to the committee to ask questions. I would like the candidate to take his place in the audience again, including the seconds. So this committee will now withdraw for deliberation, and that means that I adjourn the meeting. Gaat u weer zitten? I hereby reopen the meeting of this doctoral committee and kindly request the doctoral candidate and his seconds to take place in front of this table. The doctoral board of Eindhoven University of Technology, represented by us, has examined your dissertation and heard your defense of it. On the grounds of the aforementioned, the doctorate board has decided to award you the degree of doctor. I request the first promoter to acquit himself of the duties entrusted to him.
Uit kracht van de bevoegdheid, ons toegekend door de wet, en namens het college voor promoties, bevorder ik u, Nathan Wilma Cassee, tot dokter en verleen ik u de rechten die verbonden zijn aan de dokterstitel. Deze toekenning geschiedt met het predicaat cum laude. Ten bewijze hiervan overhandig ik u het diploma, ondertekend door rector Magnificus en de promotoren.
Please be seated.
Dear Nathan, dear Dr. Cassee, congratulations. My very, very best congratulations. It's a great privilege for me to be the first one to congratulate you. And as the tradition requires, the congratulatory speech is given in the language which we normally use when talking to each other, so I'll switch to Dutch. Het is niet de eerste keer dat ik je mag feliciteren. 5 jaar geleden studeerde je af, cum laude destijds. En ook toen had ik het genoegen om je te mogen begeleiden. En gezien onze prettige samenwerking toen en de mooie resultaten die ik toen boekte, die je eigenlijk nu aan het herbekijken ben in je recent onderzoek, voelde ik me bijzonder vereerd toen je op mijn uitnodiging bent gegaan en mij een voorstel indiende voor een PhD-positie binnen de faculteit. En deze positie bood je eigenlijk de mogelijkheid om grotendeels zelf de richting van je onderzoek te bepalen, vrij van de verwachtingen van externe financierders of wie dan ook. En het proefschrift die je vandaag verdedigt is eigenlijk het resultaat daarvan. In totaal heb je 9 conferentiepapers gepubliceerd en 3 tijdschriftartikelen, waaronder de toonaangevende conferenties ICSI en tijdschriften zoals MC en TOSM. En uiteraard gaat het niet louter alleen over de aantallen van publicaties, maar ook over het werk zelf. Je hebt baanbrekend onderzoek verricht, zoals dat door de commissie erkend wordt. Zaken zoals technical debt zijn natuurlijk bekend in de literatuur, maar we misten middelen om de ontwikkelaars te ondersteunen die daarmee te maken hebben. En inzicht in hoe de mensen sentiment en emotie gebruiken in de context van technical debt biedt ons de mogelijkheid om dergelijke tools te gaan ontwikkelen. Je werk is natuurlijk niet alleen beperkt door wetenschappers die je papers lezen, maar je bent ook actief betrokken bij samenwerking met de industrie, waar begeleiding van studenten, en doet me ontzettend veel plezier om een aantal studenten te zien in de publicity die je destijds begeleidt. Ja, cum laude predicaat. Dat is een hoogst mogelijke onderscheiding die deze universiteit kent. Het is een bijzonder zeldzaam predicaat. Niet meer dan 5% beste promovendi krijgende. En in de praktijk betekent dat eerst deze leescommissie moest stemmen. En omdat de meerderheid van de leden dat voorstel heeft gesteund, mochten ze ook de namen aangeven van 10 verschillende experts die richting de universiteitsbrede commissie zijn gegaan. Dus de experts hebben je werk geëvalueerd, de universiteit, dus de rector en als voorzitter van deze commissie heeft de beslissing bekrachtigd. En uiteindelijk was de beslissing net genomen door een geheime stemming van de leescommissie op basis van je verdediging. Dus het is niet alleen de proefschrift dat cum laude verdient, maar een hele package, een hele verhaal, en waarvoor mijn grootste waardering. En als ik aan jou denk als persoon, dan komen eigenlijk 2 woorden bij mij op. En 1 is mensen, en 1 is nauwgezet of rigoureus. Je onderzoekonderwerp betreft natuurlijk het fundamentele menselijke aspect. Emotie, er zijn weinig dingen die zo menselijk zijn als emotie. Maar tegelijkertijd was je natuurlijk ook drijvende kracht achter een heleboel activiteiten. Voor onze promovendi, je organiseerde meerdere bijeenkomsten voor promovendi, je was heel erg betrokken bij onderwijs en dat is allemaal menselijk. En die menselijke aspect combineer je met bijzonder veel aandacht voor de methodologie, voor de manier waarop bepaalde ontwerpsbeslissingen in onderzoek worden genomen. En dat is een van je sterkste kanten, die nauwkeurigheid, die nauwgezetheid, en dat wordt natuurlijk ook door meerdere collega's erkend. En dat is in zekere zin je superkracht. Dus ga voornamelijk verder in deze richting. However, of course, all this work would not have been possible without Nicole, without Professor Nicole Novielli, who has been actively working with you during all this period. And I will gladly give the word to Nicole. But again, before doing it, let me congratulate you again and let me wish you the very, very best with your next scientific adventures in Canada.
Okay, so, dear Nathan, congratulations. So today marks not just the culmination of 5 years of dedicated research activity, but also the beginning of a new chapter in advancement of software engineering and also in your life. So I had the privilege of working closely with you throughout the 5 years of your PhD journey, and I would like to thank my colleague Professor Alexander Serebrenik for inviting me to join this venture. So I am delighted to share how impressed I was by your skills as a researcher and by the outcome of your research activity. So your research has tackled one of the most challenging and intriguing intersections in our field, which is the study of human emotion and sentiment and software development technical aspects. So you have provided new understanding in this domain, bringing rigorous empirical results to the field of human aspect in software engineering. What stands out in your work is not just the theoretical depth, but also the practical implication. And your studies on sentiment and developer communication have provided valuable guidelines for both researchers and practitioners in this field. So your investigation into how negative emotion influence technical depth and its prioritization offered concrete insights that development teams can apply today and in the next future. So the quality of your research is evident in its publication record across respective journals and conferences in software engineering. But beyond this achievement, what truly impresses me is how you've grown as a researcher since you started this journey. And I watched you evolve your research question, refine your methodologies, and emerge as an expert in your domain. So your dissertation is not just written, it's an example of technical soundness and methodological rigor. You have demonstrated not only mastery of your field, but also the ability to advance it in a meaningful way, as your work bridges the gap between human and technical aspects of software engineering in a way that I am sure will influence both research and practice in the future. So congratulations, Dr. Cassee. You've earned this through hard work, persistence, and dedication. And today, not only we celebrate your achievement, marking the end of your doctoral journey, but today we are witnessing the beginning of what I am certain will be a remarkable career. So congratulations.
Esteemed John Dr. Cassee, on behalf of the Doctorate Board of the University, I congratulate you with your degree. The degree of doctor has rights as well as obligations, and I will now read the obligations. So, the holder of this degree, as a holder of this degree, you are committed to standards of scientific integrity, trustworthiness, intellectual honesty, openness, independence, and societal responsibility. These standards are described in more detail in the Netherlands Code of Conduct for Research Integrity and in the Eindhoven Code based on it. You also have duties towards society. You must be clear about the boundaries of your own expertise, and you must communicate honestly and independently about the results of your work, including potential risks associated with it. You are committed to the ethical codes for research and design involving human subjects or animals. So, these are serious words and this is a serious matter. But today is a joyful day. It's a real pleasure to congratulate you on you once more with your successful thesis defense, and I hope that you and your family, members and friends will have a most enjoyable day, rest of the day. I now would like to ask you and your seconds to take your place again in the room. So, I am now about to close the meeting, but I would like to do a few things first. So, because we had two persons online that will not have an adequate possibility to congratulate you, I first want to give Professor Storey the possibility to pass her congratulations on to you.
Yes, thank you, Nathan, for inviting me on this journey. I am very, very pleased to be part of this journey. It's rare to see such a rigorous body of studies that you've done that have implications for both research and practice. I think that you addressed a very challenging topic at a very challenging time, and throughout it all, I wasn't involved in all of it, but where I did observe what you were doing, you just showed great resilience and great skill. And of course, this is not the end, but rather the beginning of a journey, and I'm very, very happy to be with you on the next part of your journey and excited to learn from you. What you have learned through your journey. So many, many congratulations, and thank you again.
Yeah, so.
Okay, well,
you may respond, but I don't think that is very necessary. So I would like to pass on the word to Professor Penta to also pass on the congratulations.
Yeah. Thank you. Very big congratulations, Dr. Nathan, for this great achievement and for the cum laude. As I said, this has been a very rigorous work, and not only found it very sound when reviewing it, but I also enjoyed collaborating with you in one of the chapter. The thesis has been a very successful collaboration, and now I really wish you a brilliant career wherever you will want to pursue it, in academia, in industry, or wherever. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Then please take your seats again in the room. So what will be done now is that there will be a photo, and because we have people online, the photo will be in this room. So the committee will stand over there, and then the candidate will be there, and then there will be a second photo with the family. While this procedure is ongoing, I request the audience to keep seated and also refrain from congratulating, because that can be done in the reception. So afterwards the committee will leave this room and go to the reception area, and there will be a possibility to congratulate the new young doctor. So hereby I close this meeting.